Hello, and welcome to another episode of DeckTech with David. Today, I want to talk about 4 important topics in Magic and amazing cards you can use for those topics in your Explorer decks to get higher in the ranks and do even better. And those topics will be targeted removal, board wipes, non-basic land destruction, and counter magic. So, the first topic I'll be talking about today is targeted removal. Now, one great card for targeted removal is Feed the Swarm. Now, the downside of Feed the Swarm is it is a sorcery, which is a bit of a drawback, but it allows you to destroy a creature or enchantment that an opponent controls. And trust me, the downside of losing life equal to the CMC is absolutely worth it. There are some decks you'll face that just the enchantments are their biggest threat, and being able to get rid of them with a 2-drop is absolutely worth it. Now, next on target removal, I've got Haywire Might. It's a 1-drop, 1/1 that when it dies, you gain 2 life. That's a decent blocker already, but then you can sacrifice it to exile target non-creature artifact or non-creature enchantment. Now, you can use it as a blocker, and then in response to a blocking, sacrifice that to remove a problem artifact or enchantment that your opponent has, and you will gain 2 life when it dies. So it's just a really great solution to some problematic things on the board. Now, the next target removal I have is Infernal Grasp. It's a 2-drop instant to destroy target creature. Great thing about this side, the downside of losing 2 life is fairly minimal, and you can target like any creature with it. There are a lot of other 2-drop instant removals in Explorer that have various drawbacks, like you can only target certain things like non-black creatures or creatures without counters on them. And the fact that this one lets you target any creature in general is really helpful. The next piece of target removal I want to talk about is Murderous Rider. Amazing, amazing card in Explorer. Not only can you destroy a target creature or planeswalker with it, and you'll lose the 2 life like the Infernal Grasp as well, but once you do that, it goes into exile and you can cast it as a creature. So it's a removal and a creature with lifelink as well. It's just great. And the small bonus of when it dies put on the bottom of its owner's library, that probably won't come into effect, but if you put it on the bottom and then you shuffle your library with some sort of land fetch, then suddenly you've got the Murderous Rider in your library again. Now, the next removal, Doomblade, it's a pretty great 2-drop instant removal, but the one drawback of it being able to not target black creatures is a bit of a downfall, so I don't usually run it in many of my decks, but it's a decent option. Now, the next form of removal I have in here is Fateful Absence. Allows you to destroy creature or planeswalker as well, which being able to target planeswalker, trust me, absolutely, absolutely worth it. With the drawback of its controller investigating, and basically just creating them a token that allows them to pay 2 generic to draw a card, that's worth the drawback. Now, the next form of removal I have in here is Fatal Push. This is an incredible, incredible early game source of removal, and almost any deck playing black in Explorer Ranked will be running a Fatal Push. And there's a few funny things that you can abuse to trigger the Revolt. And if you have a fetch land, you can save it until their turn to sacrifice that fetch land to fetch a land, and that'll be a permanent leaving your control, so you'll be able to target a creature with mana value 4 instead of just 2. Or if you use mana from Treasure to cast it, that treasure is a permanent leaving your control. So there's a couple funny ways to abuse the Revolt trigger. Now, the next form of removal I've got mixed feelings about. It's a 2-drop to exile target non-land permanent, and for as long as the card remains exiled, its owner may play it by spending 2 more. The one issue I have is it's kind of a temporary removal. If it's a card that your opponent wants out, they'll just play it again. But if you're playing this in some sort of Azorius control deck, blue-white, where you can counter it when they try to cast it again, then I think it's worth it for the temporary removal to be able to counter it again. Now, a piece of removal that I just got into that I really like is this Rite of Oblivion. I just built a white-black Orzhov Aristocrats deck where the goal of it is to try to sacrifice my creatures and get triggers off of them dying. So to be able to sacrifice one of my creatures and get all those triggers, to exile a target non-land permanent, which that's a lot of things you could target with it, and then have flashbacks so I get 2 casts of it, It is so useful in that deck. The only thing I hate about it is that it's sorcery, but it's absolutely worth it. And the fact that it's exile as well, I can get rid of something like a Heliod, something that has indestructible, or something that'll be shuffled into the library after it dies or something like that because it's being exiled instead. Absolutely incredible. Incredible piece of removal, I believe. Now, Raven Form is another pretty decent piece of target removal. Allows you to exile a target artifact or creature. The one downside is its controller makes a 1/1 blue bird with flying when you do so, which isn't too bad. The other drawback is, as you can see, it's a sorcery, which is a little rough, of course, but the fact that you can foretell it, paying 2 generic on a turn where you don't have anything else to do, and then at any point in time later it just costs 1 blue mana to exile a target artifact or creature, is pretty decent piece of removal for blue. And now another piece of target removal that I think is excellent is Skyclave Apparition. When it enters, it allows you to exile a target non-land, non-token permanent you don't control with CMC 4 or less, and when it leaves, its owner just creates a little illusion where X was that mana cost. And this is great, because a lot of the other sources of removal that exile something underneath it, when it leaves, the opponent gets that back. But this time when it leaves, they just get a stupid little token. So blinking Skyclave Apparition is absolutely broken. Now another piece of target removal I like is Banishing Light, which is just a 3-drop enchantment that exiles something underneath it until it leaves. It's a great little piece if you're playing white or if you're playing enchantment matters and you want to get rid of a permanent they control. And then Borrowed Time is literally the exact same thing. Now Brutal Cathar is kind of similar to Skyclave Apparition, except for that when it enters or transforms into this side, the Brutal Cathar exile target creature until it leaves. And then the backside of it is just a 3/3 with first strike and ward, pay 3 life. So the backside is just a decent attacker. And then when it transforms from the backside back to the front side again, you get another creature. So if you play it right, you can just keep exiling creatures underneath this. The one problem with it is it's prone to removal, and once it gets removed, they get all those creatures back. Now, another piece of removal that I like is Conclave Tribunal. Very similar to the Borrowed Time one, except for it's 1 more generic mana and allows you to tap your creatures while you're casting it to pay for 1 generic. So if you tap 3 creatures you control, you can possibly pay just 1 white for this, which is pretty decent. So if you're playing something that creates a lot of tokens, something like that, it's a pretty decent piece. Now, another piece of target removal I really like is Ossification. This is a new one that I've been really enjoying. It gets enchanted onto a basic land you control, and when it enters the battlefield, exile target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls until it leaves. And that's pretty good because, of course, they could just remove it by destroying it itself, but the fact that it goes onto a basic land, as long as you're playing basic lands, you have a basic land out, it's not too much of a downside because there are not many things in Explorer meta that allow you to destroy basic lands. There are a few things I'll go over later to destroy non-basic lands, but not much to destroy basic lands. So they'll almost never destroy that basic land, but they might destroy the ossification. And the fact that it can target planeswalkers as well is incredible. And the fact it's only 2 mana instead of the other ones being like 3. I really like this piece. And then another little weird one of target removal, Portable Hole. When it enters, you can exile a target non-land permanent and an opponent controls with mana value 2 or less until it leaves. So it's kind of a downside only being able to do a non-land permanent with 2 mana or less. But the fact that it's just a 1-drop is pretty good. And the fact that it's an artifact. Like all the other ones that exile underneath it are enchantments, but the fact that it's an artifact means you can play it in Artifact Matters decks or things that happen when you cast artifacts. So I think it's a pretty decent piece for that. And now we will move on to board wipes. So one board wipe I really enjoy is Vanquish the Horde. Not only does it have an incredible art that I love, it's got a beautiful painting of Audric, which got a mad respect for my boy Audric, but it costs 1 less for each creature on the battlefield, period, not that your opponents control, on the battlefield, period. Destroy all creatures. So there just has to be 6 creatures on the battlefield between you and your opponent, and suddenly it's a 2-drop to board wipe. And that's incredible. Now the next piece of board wipe I like is Doomscar. It is a 5-drop to destroy all creatures, but you can pay 2 to foretell it, and then 3 to cast it at a later time. And the fact that you can split the cost out like that means you can have a turn 3 board wipe. Just turn 2 foretell it, turn 3 cast it. So if your opponents are playing something crazy like mono red, just haste and swing out, or elves, or they just build an insane board of creatures by turn 3 or 4, then you just destroy it by turn 3, and you don't even have to have that much ramp to do so, and I think that's a great option. Now the next board wipe I want to show is Meat Hook Massacre, one of my absolute favorite cards to be printed recently. Absolutely love this card. Not broken at all, not broken at all. So, Meat Hook Massacre, you pay 2 black and an X, and when it enters, each creature gets -X until the end of turn. And whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life, and whenever a creature opponent control dies, you gain 1 life. So, not only can you basically wipe the entire board with it if you have enough mana, and you'll gain life and your opponents will lose life for the things that die, but then it's just a permanent that sits around. And those triggers will keep happening. It's not just when it ETBs and kills the creatures on then. It's just forever while it's around. So it's an amazing piece and incredible in that Aristocrats deck I was talking about earlier. Now the next board wipe I want to talk about is Farewell. I hate this card. I've never played with it, but it is ridiculously powerful. You can choose however many of those you want for 6 mana and basically get rid of basically everything on the board. The only thing you pretty much can is Planeswalkers, but you'll exile pretty much all problems on the board with this, and it is insane if you can cast it and not have countered. It is insane. Now the next board wipe I want to talk about is Settle the Wreckage. This is a pretty good one. Settle the Wreckage is a 2 generic, a 2 white mana instant. Exile all attacking creatures target player controls. That player may search his or her library for that many basic lands, put them on the battlefield tapped, and shuffle their library. So there is the downside that you'll be ramping them with all that removal. It's kind of like a Path to Exile, but for like all attacking creatures. But the upside of being able to remove all their attacking creatures from play for 4 mana can absolutely be worth it. And also in higher Explorer ranks, you have less chances that your opponents are running a bunch of basic lands, so they might not even get that much value out of it. Especially if they swing with a bunch of creatures, they might just get like 5 lands off of it, which it's a lot of mana, but I think it's worth it for the trade-off. And now for the next topic I want to talk about is non-basic land removal. So there are quite a bit of meta decks right now in Explorer Ranked that use the animated lands to try to kill the opponents off. Like the blue one that turns into that big 7/7 and the white one that turns into a dragon. It's usually Azorius control decks. Or they'll try to stop anything you do, wipe the board, counter everything you do, and then kill you with those animated creatures. So having something like a Field of Ruin is super helpful to stop that. And if they have one of those lands out, you always want to wait until they try to animate it to use the Field of Ruin in response, so that they lose all that value from animating it. And if you notice they're not really playing any animated lands and you have the 2 extra generic mana on like their end step, you can just sacrifice it to destroy like a non-basic land they control to get a basic land of yours out as well and be able to deck thin yourself as well so you're drawing into less lands. So it's useful even if you're not playing against something scary. And the next piece I want to show is Demolition Field. It's almost the exact same as Field of Ruin, honestly, except for only the person's land you're destroying and yourself will look for lands, whereas Field of Ruin is everybody searches for lands, which doesn't make a difference in Explorer. It only makes a difference in like 4-player formats. So as far as Explorer goes, they're basically the same card. Now the next piece of non-basic removal I want to talk about is Boseiju Who Endures, which is a legendary land that can tap for green. You can just play it like a normal land, or you can pay 1 and a green to discard it and destroy target artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land opponent controls. And then that player may search their library for a land with a basic land type and put it on the battlefield. And that ability costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature you control. So you can discard it from your hand in response to them animating a land to destroy the scary animated lands, and they just get a basic land. So it's kind of like a Field of Ruin from your hand, except for you don't get a basic land as well. And it's just a really great piece of tech, because it can destroy artifacts and enchantments as well, if they have something scary there. Now the next piece of non-basic land removal I want to talk about is Assassin's Trophy, which this one can target a basic land if you want. Don't know why I'd want to. A green and a black instant to destroy target permanent opponent controls, and they may search their land for a basic card, put on the battlefield, and shuffle. Permanent, period. This is one of the only cards in Explorer that can target just any permanent in general. Amazing source of removal. Absolutely amazing. And the fact that they get 1 basic land for it, it's not that bad of a downside, especially if what you're destroying is a scary non-basic land. Now the next piece of non-basic land removal I want to talk about is Cleansing Wildfire, which is one generic and a red sorcery to destroy target land, and its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle their library. And you get the benefit of drawing a card. So it does have the downside that it's at sorcery speed, but you can remove their terrifying land that they might animate at a later point in time with this Cleansing Wildfire, and then it replaces itself with a draw. So I think it's absolutely worth it. And it can be used in some pretty funny decks. If you target your own indestructible land, then you get to ramp and get another land and draw, and that land doesn't get destroyed because it's indestructible. So there's a couple different uses for it. Now, the next piece of tech I want to talk about is grave removal. Now, there are a lot of meta decks that have sort of grave recursions, like the one that I think of off the top of my head is the Greasefang Parhelion deck, which is just can be so terrifying and so hard to deal with. But there's also just other decks, a lot of decks just have some grave recursion casually in them as well. So there's a few great pieces of tech you can put in to combat that issue. And one of those pieces is Scavenger Grounds, which is a land desert that can tap for generic mana, or 2 and tap to sacrifice a desert and exile all cards from all graveyards. So you can sacrifice itself with this ability and then exile all cards from all graveyards in response to them doing something from the grave, or in response to their grave starting to become a threat and having cards that they can flashback and stuff. I don't personally run this in any of my decks just because I really need the colors and the generic mana that it taps for. It might slow me down a little bit, but I could absolutely see it being useful in some decks, especially colorless decks. I would run that in a colorless deck in a heartbeat. Now, the next piece of grave removal tech I want to talk about is Scavenging Ooze. One in a generic for a 2/2. It's already vanilla at that point, and then pay a green at any point in time at instant speed. Exile a target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature, put a +1/+1 on it, and you gain 1 life. So you can hold up the green mana, wait until they try to recur something scary from their grave, and then pay the green to exile that card from their grave. Doesn't matter if it was a creature or not, you exiled it, but if it happened to be a creature, you get the benefit of putting a +1/+1 on it and gaining a life. And you can just save a bunch of green mana if they don't do anything scary from their grave. Wait until their end step, or wait until you block with Scavenging Ooze and start exiling stuff to buff it. And it doesn't even have to be from an opponent's graveyard, too. You can exile your own creatures from your own grave if you don't have any grave recursion tech and you want to buff your Scavenging Ooze. Now, the next piece of grave removal tech I want to talk about is Lantern of the Lost. So when Lantern of the Lost enters the battlefield, you exile a target card from a graveyard, so you can get rid of 1 problem card when it enters. And then you 1 and tap to exile the Lantern of the Lost and exile all cards from all graveyards, then draw a card. So just wait until they try to recur something, or wait until the grave starts to become scary, tap and exile it, exile all graves, and you draw a card. Seems like pretty good to me. Now, the next piece of grave removal tech I want to talk about is Soul Guide Lantern. Now, Soul Guide Lantern is very similar to the previous Lantern, except for when it enters, you exile target card from a graveyard, same as the previous one, and they're both 1-drops. Except for this one, you tap and sack to exile each opponent's graveyard, or 1 and tap and sack to draw a card. So basically, you can play it, leave it on the battlefield, wait until they try to do something scary from the grave and sacrifice it to exile your opponent's graveyard. Or if you have that 1 generic mana and you notice that your opponent isn't playing any graveyard matters stuff or grave recursion, you can just sacrifice it for a card draw. And I think that's pretty good. Now, the next piece of grave removal I want to talk about is Tormod's Crypt. Tormod's Crypt is a 0-drop that you can just tap and sack it to exile all cards from target player's grave. Not a lot of extra value on here, but it is a 0-drop, so if you have a deck that cares about casting artifacts, absolutely worth running. Now, the next piece of grave removal I want to talk about is Leyline of the Void. 2 generic and 2 black for an enchantment, and if it's in your opening hand, you may begin with it on the battlefield. So if you got in your starting hand, it's on there for free, you didn't do anything. And if a card would be put into an opponent's grave from anywhere, exile it instead. Absolutely amazing card to get rid of opponent's graveyards. And unless you're playing something where you care about how many cards are in your opponent's graveyard, I would absolutely recommend playing it in black. Now, the last piece of grave removal I want to talk about is Cling to Dust. My personal favorite. I really, really enjoy this card. It is just a 1-drop instant, exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature card, you gain 3 life. Otherwise, you draw a card. So you can wait with just that 1 swamp sitting untapped, and in response to them trying to recur something from their grave, just exile it. And if you notice they're not playing any grave recursion or graveyard matter stuff, just target a non-creature card and you get a card draw from it. And then it has the escape cost, so it just casually sits there in case you want to use it to draw another card. It's just something great that you can have sitting there to use your unused mana if you don't have anything else to use it in their end step. Like, I usually hold out mana for counter spells, and then if I don't have anything to counter, I cast the Cling to Dust and draw a card. I think it's a great piece of tech. And in an emergency, you can exile a creature to gain 3 life if you're almost dead. It's just got a lot of potential value. I really enjoy this card. Now, the last important topic I want to talk about is counter magic. And honestly, you can play any counter spells in your deck. It doesn't matter. As long as you have counter magic, you'll be fine. My couple of favorites, though, are Didn't Say Please and Thought Collapse, which are basically the exact same card. Both of them are 1 generic and 2 blue. Counter target spell, its controller mills 3 cards. And I love these because I play a Dimir Rogue deck that has a lot of mill tech in it. And these are just amazing pieces of control that also happen to mill them. And then my third favorite in that deck is Drown in the Loch, which is a blue and a black instant counter target spell with mana value less than or equal to the number of cards in its controller's graveyard, or destroy target creature with mana value less than or equal to the number of cards in the controller's graveyard. So it's not only an amazing counterspell, but it's also an amazing creature removal if you are running that mill tech and playing Dimir. Alright, so those are the 4 topics I want to talk about, and the great pieces you could put in your Explorer ranked decks to try to climb the ranks and combat your opponents. Thanks for watching DeckTech with David.